Good evening. I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome back to Vampire Reviews. Are you all having a wonderfully spooky October so far? Interview with the Vampire Month continues. Yes, I am wearing the hoodie and the t-shirt. Yes, I did buy all the official AMC merchandise a month before the show came out. This show has become my life. Episode 4, The Ruthless Pursuit of Blood with All a Child's Demanding. This title quote from the book comes from when Louis is describing how Claudia was simply unlike him in Lestat, and he just couldn't comprehend her. Little children are greedy, always wanting more of what they love, with no sense of self-restraint. And this was how Claudia in the book took to killing. As a 5-year-old girl, she was too young to have any sense of right or wrong about it, only knew that it gave her pleasure, especially as her brain seemed to have reset to infancy, and it was years before she even started speaking like a child again. For the first time, this title actually does not end up getting dropped in the episode, but that's because we don't need Louis telling us how shamelessly greedy Claudia is for blood. We'll see it well enough for ourselves. The episode opens with the sun rising over the desert, with Daniel in Dubai pacing back and forth on Louis' penthouse balcony in the sunshine on the phone with his editor, explaining that he's turning this interview with the vampire into a full book, not an article. Since Louis kept the tapes and the first interview was never published, this book never happened in the universe. So when Daniel publishes his new book based on the second interview, we can anticipate that all the rest of the series events in the rest of the books will be due to follow with a pushed back timeline into the modern era. My theory is that the great conversion Louis was talking about in episode 2 will lead to Akasha's rise and reign of terror, perhaps still sparked by Lestat responding to the new book with some modern equivalent of his rockstar era he had in the 80s. I predict that we will probably see all that TVL and Queen of the Damned stuff in season 3 if the show gets renewed again next year. Louis' assistant/worshipper, Rasheed, comes to the balcony and says he hopes Daniel had a comfortable night, so I guess he did go to bed at some point. Episode 1, Daniel flew a red-eye flight to Dubai overnight and landed just before sunrise. Then the interview started at 10:08 in the morning and went until sunset. Then in episode 2, it started at dinner time and took us through the meal. Episode 3 was after dinner martinis, and then Daniel went to bed and slept the night, and now we're at the next morning again. Even though it's felt like ages, he's actually only been interviewing this vampire for 24 hours now, with time for a night's rest in the middle there. Daniel tells Rasheed that due to his Parkinson's, his nights are never comfortable, which leads Rasheed to tell him that they hacked his medical information and got Daniel's doctor's approval to give him his Parkinson's medication transfusion in Dubai, and a doctor will be coming to do that tomorrow, and we'll get to see that in episode 6. So, according to a couple medical professionals I talked to, a transfusion makes no sense. They probably mean infusion, but even this is not how Daniel's Parkinson's would be treated at all. Daniel's not at end stage, and he would just be taking his medication by mouth. He'd only need an infusion if he wasn't capable of using his mouth. And boy, does this Daniel use his mouth. He is annoyed how the vampire and his assistant keep violating his privacy and hacking his information, and he asks where Louis is, but Rasheed tells him Louis will be sleeping for the day. After staying up for the entire day yesterday to do the interview, Louis must be pretty tired. The fact that vampires in this show can and do stay awake all day must make their lives much easier than they are in the books, where they are entirely helpless and unconscious during the day and have trouble interacting with mortal society that does most of its business during the daytime. Here, vampires aren't so much creatures of the night, if they don't want to be, but creatures of the inside. As long as they stay out of direct sunlight, they can do whatever they want during the daytime, so they don't have nearly as much of that loneliness and isolation from humanity that they do in canon. Rasheed takes Daniel to the reading room, which is another room in Louis' penthouse that looks like a cold meat locker made of concrete. Not even any paintings on these walls. The bookshelves are all floating from the ceiling without any ladder in sight, which makes me think Louis here can probably fly now in the modern era, and he just floats up there to get his books. Remember, we saw Lestat float up into the air when he was drinking Louis's blood the first time in episode 1. But the power of flight, which is called the Cloud Gift in the books, has never been used or mentioned again. Since the show has given modern Louis the power to read minds, to do the little drink, and the fire gift, him being able to fly now isn't too much of a stretch, since they've changed the lore that those powers come at a much younger age for vampires here, and now Louis is about the same age that Lestat was when he first met him. The cold, echoing sterility of the reading room is offset by a live tree planted in a sort of Zen garden sand pit underneath a grow light lamp that's faked to look like a skylight. When Daniel comments on it, Rasheed says that their interior designer forced this tree on Louis because she thought he was missing the natural world, implying that Louis otherwise would have wanted everything in his home to embody cold, detached solitude. If Louis has been missing the natural world, that probably means he spends all of his time in the city, or even mostly in this very penthouse. So even though the privacy restrictions of Dubai offer a haven for vampires to keep their dark secrets, it's at the cost of any connection to the beauties of nature, which in the Chronicles is something that vampires very much value. Anne Rice spends paragraphs and pages describing the natural beauty of the world and its meaning for the vampires. The other thing that seems out of place in this cold, sterile room is an antique desk where Daniel is invited to do his reading. This is exactly the sort of desk that the vampires in the Chronicles love to have. In fact, Lestat even says he has a bit of a problem with buying too many desks. But that's because they fit in well with the rest of their decor. Here, the desk stands out like a sore thumb, especially with the extremely modern lamp sitting on it, drawing our eye to show that Louis isn't entirely disconnected from the warmth and opulence of his past. Rasheed unlocks several archival boxes that contain Claudia's 100-year-old diaries and tells Daniel how precious they are and that he is allowed to read them to gain her perspective on the story Louis's been telling. Rasheed suggests that Daniel begin with Claudia's first diary from 1917, the year Louis rescued her from the fire. So, of course, Daniel looks at the one from 1945 first. The glimpse of the page shows us that Claudia is writing about just arriving in Paris. She says we, but not who's with her, though my guess is it's just Louis. So timeline. In the book, Louis, Lestat, and Claudia lived together for 6.5 decades. Then in 1860, Claudia kills Lestat, and she and Louis run away to Europe. They then spent about 10 years traveling around Eastern Europe, looking for other vampires like she's read about in some, vampire folklore books. The very same sort of books that inspired Bram Stoker to write Dracula. Then, after a decade of disappointment, she and Louis go to Paris, arriving around 1870-ish. So, if this Claudia arrived in Paris in 1945, that means she and Louis and Lestat lived together for a much shorter period of time before it all went bad. In all the panels and interviews that the showrunners have done, they told us that season 1 of the show would go up until 1940, just before Claudia and Louis are leaving New Orleans for Europe. So, timeline. It sounds like in the show, the family stays together only for about 23 years, and then Claudia and Louis spend 5 years doing their vampire hunting thing in Eastern Europe before then going to Paris in 1945. And we all know what happens in Paris. And if you don't, well, you'll find out in season 2, which is definitely happening. AMC renewed the show before the first episode even aired. I love being able to piece together the new timeline from all the bits of info they're dropping here. Next, Daniel looks at a diary from 1941, where Claudia is talking about being in Romania during World War II and how she's not enjoying the quality of human victims available there. This girl has expensive tastes. She is not here for scrawny, malnourished prisoners of war. She says that the humans' tragic existence during the war is joyless, and it reminds her of her horrible human life at the rooming house Louis rescued her from before he made her a vampire, which makes her angry. And she did not come to Europe to be angry. As Daniel reads these pages, we see again his hand tremor, reminding us of the way his own mortality is looming. He is repulsed and tosses the diary down before finally going back to the beginning, as Rasheed advised, and we dive into the story now from Claudia's perspective, played by Bailey Bass, her voice taking over the narration for this episode instead of Louis'. As she recounts her rescue from the burning house, she tells us she thought Louis was an angel.
The Black Angel took me to a fine house.
And when he brought her home to his townhouse, she thought it was heaven. Louis is crying, calling out for Lestat, begging him to help her. Lestat is upset that after all the mess with Louis' brothel and the race riots, that Louis has found yet another way to cling to human entanglement, but then Louis begs Lestat to make her into a vampire instead. It wouldn't be human entanglement, it would be immersion into vampire existence, and Louis is desperate for anything to achieve redemption for the way his vampire actions destroyed so many lives with the race riots. He has pinned his entire sense of self-worth on keeping this one girl from dying. Lestat tries to talk Louis out of it, thinking Louis wants to make some kind of pet out of her. But then he has the realization that she could be part of their family, a daughter. Louis was about to abandon Lestat, leave Lestat in his worst fear of being always alone. But if Lestat does this thing for Louis that he's begging for, then he'll stay, and the three of them can start a fresh life together. Despite how much Lestat wants Louis to stay with him, he still thinks this is a very bad idea. But Louis tearfully begs him, and Lestat, who can never say no to Louis, who does everything for Louis, who can deny him nothing, finally gives in and makes Claudia into a vampire. Once again, the show has completely subverted our expectations from the book. The difference here is that in the book, Louis absolutely does not want Claudia to become a vampire. He could think of no more horrible fate to inflict on anyone, much less an innocent child. No, it is entirely Lestat's idea to make her a vampire as a way to baby trap Louis into staying with him. When Lestat starts to do it, Louis attacks him, trying to get him to stop, and then Lestat throws Louis across the room with only a flick of his hand, which is one of the only times we get a glimpse of Lestat's secretly extreme vampire strength in the book, which is such a contrast to the other times we read about them grappling when Louis seems to get the upper hand. Those times, Lestat was letting Louis win and hold him back. So in the book, Lestat is very young and reckless and impulsive, and besides just wanting to force Louis to stay with him, he's also desperate for a companion of his own that Louis just refuses to be. Someone who will enjoy killing and being a vampire the same way Lestat does, which is what Claudia becomes. Lestat's little mini-me. But in the show, Lestat is now 150 years old, and I was really wondering how they were going to reconcile such rash actions now that he's not so young and stupid. But now they don't even have to. Now that it's Louis' idea, and Lestat is extremely reluctant, the show has removed much of the villainousness from Lestat's character. As the showrunners have told us many times, they want to show the more sympathetic and likable Lestat from the later books. Yet, Lestat still becomes sympathetic and likable regardless of this, knowing how wrong it was to make Claudia, but not ever really regretting it because he loved her so much. That the show has aged Claudia up from 5 years old to 14 helps to make Louis' idea to make her a vampire less unforgivably horrific. Vampire life wouldn't be so terrible for a 14-year-old who would be capable of being independent if she wanted to be and not always have to rely on her father. So Louis also doesn't look so bad for this part of it, at least. Yes, making an innocent child into a bloodthirsty murder machine is bad, but at least she wouldn't be tormented by being eternally attached to him this time. Aging Claudia up in general makes sense because finding a 5 or 6-year-old actor who can play a vampire who grows mature in a tiny body would be extremely difficult. Both the movie and the Broadway musical aged her up to about 10 so that they could cast older actors. But even at 10, Claudia would still be too young to live an independent life, so her character conflict remained the same as the books in those two versions. The showrunners told us that they had to age Claudia up even further for this version because child labor laws in New Orleans, where they filmed the show, would not allow them to use an actor younger than 18 for the amount of work that the show required. So they made Claudia 14, and this allowed them to explore an entirely new character arc for her. Another big change here is that because Louis rescues Claudia from the neighborhood where his people are suffering, she is also Black. It is incredibly different, and you really can't compare her to the character in the book at all. There are some little things that I will mention because, they're interesting callbacks to the book, but she is an entirely new character with entirely new themes and meaning in her vampire journey. I see it as just another aspect of the AU that this story has decided to be, so get on board. This is a story about what if Louis and Lestat adopted a 14-year-old Black girl instead of a tiny little white kid? How would that go? And boy, does it go! As Lestat makes Claudia into a vampire, she tells us that she realizes they aren't angels, but actually hell demons. But since she's got nothing else going for her in her life, she decides to make the best of it. Thank goodness she's got such an optimistic and easygoing attitude. Would have been rough there if the whole, hell demon thing had, freaked her out or weighed on her conscience and tormented her. She has such a completely perky and naive acceptance of all the things that would probably scare a normal child. And if we go by the books, we could chalk this up to the detachment that vampires are supposed to feel from their previous human fears as soon as they become outside of nature. Except this is the complete opposite of Louis's horror at realizing he's become a monster in episode 2. And the show gives us no explanation for why Claudia's transition is so different from Louis's. In the book, Claudia was just too young to know any better, but since this one is old enough to have a developed sense of right and wrong, there has to be some reason why she's just totally and completely chill with becoming a monster and living with 2 strange serial killers, eating people, burning bodies. And that reason is, she just is. Well, that's convenient. Dodge that bullet. Claudia is still hungry, and she wants to drink Louis's blood, so they clean her up and dress her in new clothes and take her out hunting for her first human victim. And it seems like the race riots have already died down from earlier tonight. Before, Louis could see all the carnage and chaos from his window. But now, when they go out into the backyard, it's peaceful New Orleans evening with perky jazz music wafting in from the streets in the background. Okay, both Louis and Lestat are also wearing new outfits, looking snazzy and bright after the somber, dark clothes they had on in the scene where they almost broke up. So you can think maybe this is the next night or later on in the timeline. Maybe time has passed since the night of the riots. But would they really go a whole day and night or more without feeding Claudia? And she's asking questions about if this is her house to live in and stuff about being a vampire that are very much right away questions that she would be asking on the first night.
You're a vampire now. You're wondering if your nails will be like that forever. And the answer is yes.
Did the show forget that there were riots and fire and carnage in the streets tonight? Shh, don't think about it. Time is fuzzy here in Claudia's diary. You could see it as something like, with this one act of redemption, not only has Louis cleansed his soul, but also made all the chaos he caused for the people entirely disappear from the consciousness of the scene around him. It may still be out there, but they don't perceive it because they have embraced the happy little vampire bubble.
We're a family.
And indeed, the way the rest of the episode plays out, it has this much more dreamlike and vaguely timeless quality to it, with montages and disconnection from reality, now that Louis has finally broken the last links with his human entanglement and begins living the fully vampire life Lestat had wanted for him from the start. When they tell Claudia that vampires can hear thoughts, she asks Lestat to prove it. He tells her that as her maker, their minds are entirely cut off to each other. They can't hear each other's thoughts, they can't project their voices into each other's head, they can't use any psychic powers on each other at all. A complete mental wall. Have you been listening to the official companion podcast to this show? Yes, there is an official podcast, and it's great. Go check it out. Last week, the host of the podcast interviewed Jewel Gomez, author of the amazing queer vampire book, The Gilda Stories, which we discussed here on Vampire Book Club a few months ago. And the host asked Gomez if this nature of vampire powers was common, or if Anne Rice invented it, that makers and fledglings' minds are blocked to each other. And Gomez said that she was sure it hadn't existed before Anne Rice, that usually vampires can just read anyone's minds with no limits. But Anne Rice didn't come up with this randomly. In Interview with a Vampire, mind reading isn't a thing vampires can do. The vampire Armand does have incredible psychic powers. He can project illusions into Louis's mind, weave spells, but there's no indication that he can hear Louis's thoughts. And when he needs to tell Louis something privately, he whispers very quietly. No telepathic voice. But by the time she was writing The Vampire Lestat, Anne Rice decided that she wanted to add mind reading to the average vampire's bag of tricks. And in order not to add any gaping plot holes to Louis's book, she justified why he never mentions this power by making Louis one of the weakest vampires. Made so on purpose by Lestat to preserve his humanity, because Lestat values humanity so much more than any other vampires do. Similarly, Claudia was also too weak to read minds. But, of course, the phenomenal, amazing, super-powered Lestat should be able to have this skill. She invented it for him in his book, after all, but if he could do it all along, why didn't he just read Louis and Claudia's minds all the time and avoid all the horrible stuff that happened between them? So she came up with the rule that minds between makers and fledglings are completely blocked, and Louis and Claudia were too weak to do it to each other or know about it at all. It was the perfect way to keep the dramatic tension in the first book making sense. But the show doesn't have to be held to that anymore. They are rewriting the first book. So now both Louis and Claudia can read each other's minds and talk to each other in their heads without Lestat able to hear them. Lestat immediately nips this in the bud, and they make a family promise to never speak to each other this way and keep no secrets from each other. That's so nice of them. I guess the show wanted them to have this power, but not too much, because then it would undercut dramatic tension at points, so they purposefully avoid ever using it, except when they don't, and that's for dramatic purposes. Just roll with it. We are here to have fun, vampire fun, as they're driving Claudia out on her first hunt on the completely quiet streets with no riots at all. She has already come up with nicknames for her new parents, Uncle Les and Daddy Lou, and she tells us that they have a funny way of being nice to each other over a shot of Lestat stroking Louis's shoulder. I guess she's never seen gay people before, but this shot of them touching is so welcome because the amount of moments of us seeing them actually being affectionate in their relationship have been so rare, with all the scenes in the last 2 episodes focusing so heavily on their problems. And given that this is supposed to be the same night where Louis threatened to leave Lestat, seeing this little moment of clinginess from Lestat but with nothing reciprocated from Louis says so much that, of course, Claudia doesn't realize, but the audience will. They find her a wino in a deserted park, and Claudia finally expresses some reluctance about the idea of killing someone. Louis tells her that she doesn't have to, that she can eat animals, just like he does. I guess he's not giving that up. In the book, Claudia entering his life is what finally ends Louis' starvation penance with animals, and he accepts his vampire nature and becomes a killer, saying that killing was the only way he could know peace, and having Claudia in his life made him want to be strong for her. Another subversion here. Will the weakness and fatigue caused by eating only animals lead Louis to fail Claudia this time? Lestat tells Claudia how amazing killing feels, and she goes out to try it. While she walks away, Lestat and Louis debate the skirt they chose for her to wear, and it's so great to get this tiny little moment of their casual domestic dynamic. Moments like these are so few and far between amid all the drama of the show. I'm grasping at crumbs here. Claudia is grossed out by the wino and doesn't want to touch him. Louis is happy, thinking she'll stick to animals just like him, but then she smells a policeman in the distance and zooms off at vampire speed to attack him. I guess eau de cop smells better than drunk funk. Louis and Lestat freak out and run after her because killing cops is a huge no-no. Like with the lawyer in episode 2, they are too visible of victims, and vampires need to be cautious who they kill to keep their secret and be able to still live a fancy life in society. Night 1, and Claudia is already breaking all the rules and throwing their life into chaos. As the cop is dying, he calls her a devil, and Claudia likes it. And despite the no-no of her choice of victim, Lestat is pleased she takes after him in ruthlessness and vampire pride. They bring the body back home to burn, and Claudia is still hungry and wants more.
I'm so hungry. I think I'm gonna die.
In a convenient exposition dump, Lestat says her growing child metabolism is permanent now, along with her teenage histrionics. Unlike Claudia in the book, whose mind matured as she grew older, even though her body didn't, this Claudia will permanently have the brain of a teenage drama queen. While Louis and Lestat argue about what's best for her, she zooms across the street and eats the jazz musician who had been serenading us all this while, right out in public where anyone could see, and Louis and Lestat realize they are in way over their heads. They never have this problem in the book, not until Claudia was 60 years old and started acting out as revenge. We've got a whole brand new dynamic here with this Claudia as a loose cannon they have to control right from the start. A project for them to bond over. Marriage saved. An ambiguous amount of time passes to a typical sunrise where the family is getting ready for bed. On her way up, Claudia eats a macaroon, which grosses her out because she doesn't like human food anymore, which, why did they even have that macaroon bouquet in the house? She takes a moment to open up the skylight over the piano and has fun sticking her hand in the sunbeam and watching it burn and heal. That the show keeps reminding us about this skylight really has me thinking it's going to come back into play at some climactic scene in the future. I'm watching you, Skylight. Lestat is annoyed by Claudia's devotion to writing in her diary, but Louis supports it, thankfully, which is how we're even getting to see these scenes right now. In the books, we do find out later that Claudia actually did have a diary, but she got it much later on in her life and only wrote in it a handful of times, and somewhat ironically, not thinking much of the practice of diary keeping at all, mostly only writing hurtful things about her parents. Nothing like the constant day-to-day description show Claudia gives us. She kept it hidden in a secret panel in the wall of her room, where a century after her death, it was found in the book Queen of the Damned and then featured significantly in the book Merrick. Show Claudia can't seem to stop writing in her diary, even when she's supposed to be sleeping. And just like in the book, this Claudia sleeps in Louis's coffin with him. Last year, when we all found out that Claudia was being aged up to 14, there was a lot of concern about whether her and Louis sharing a coffin together would go from being a cute father-daughter dynamic snuggling down to something kind of inappropriate and creepy. But the show handles it by having them sleep head to toe, and since in this version Louis is completely gay, not bi like he is in the book, it doesn't come off as icky at all. In her childish curiosity, Claudia asks Lestat who his vampire maker was, but all he says is, "When I am tired, I am not so kind," which is actually a line from the book that he says right after he makes Claudia. In the book, when he says it, it's a threat to Louis. Lestat has just given Louis Claudia as his new daughter, but he's threatening that if Louis doesn't care for her and keep her close, Lestat might maybe hurt her because he's tired, further sealing that Louis can't run off now and leave Claudia alone with Lestat. And Louis tells us that though Lestat was always sweet to Claudia's face, he often threatened Louis with harming her to keep Louis in his place. But here, the line is just used as a grumpy dismissal, and even though Lestat's secrets about his maker cause a huge rift in the family in the book, and Louis hounds him with questions about it, here they let the subject drop right away. Lestat and Louis bicker in French about why Claudia's asking questions, even though she gave up on the questions immediately, and she just tells us how funny she thinks it is when they fight in French. But it's time for Claudia to get her own coffin. In the book, she wanted one of her own just to have it, but she never actually used it. She still always slept with Louis, who had been heartbroken at the thought of her not wanting to sleep with him anymore. Here, both Louis and she want their own space to sleep. And at the coffin store, the seller gets weird vibes from the murder family as Claudia squeals like a little kid about the fluffy pink coffin she wants, so they comedically have to kill him. But Louis and Lestat have this whole routine down pat now, with Louis drawing the curtains closed while Lestat feasts on the guy. They're so in sync. Lestat and Claudia did kill the coffin maker in the book, but Louis wasn't involved with that and is very judgmental of them for doing it. The next time they all go to bed, Claudia peeks out of her coffin and sees Lestat sneaking into Louis' after they think she's asleep. As they snuggle down together, Louis tells Lestat he's missed him, and this is like the first sweet thing we've ever actually heard Louis say to Lestat. Was he talking to Lestat like this in their private moments all along and just never told Daniel about it? Or did he only just now start treating Lestat romantically, 7 years into their marriage, now that he's let go of his human life and doesn't have to focus on all the oppression and injustices that used to overwhelm him? I'm glad they finally got there, and though we don't get to see them kiss, and I couldn't hear it with my speakers, the subtitles tell us that there are kissing noises going on in the background. Why are these moments so few and far between? The showrunners described the series as a romance, but after all the sexy stuff they showed us in the first episode, Louis and Lestat's relationship has turned into like a 1950s sitcom version of a married couple. Is the show just afraid of showing too much intimacy between two men? An indeterminate amount of time passes, and Louis and Claudia are on a daddy-daughter date in a rowboat in the bayou. They may both be bloodthirsty monsters, but they still do gentle human things like enjoy nature and catching fireflies. The tropical wilderness that surrounds them, full of the sounds of night creatures, is the complete opposite of Louis's modern life in Dubai and his cold, sterile penthouse. This is the nature he's been missing now that this happy time in his life is gone. Claudia is concerned that Lestat's keeping secrets from them, but Louis dismisses this as nothing important. Unlike in the book, when Lestat withheld important vampire information from Louis and Claudia in order to keep Louis dependent on him, here Lestat's taught him tons of vampire skills, as well as talked openly about his past multiple times. The only question he hasn't answered is who made him, but now Claudia thinks he has even more secrets, and unlike Louis, she's dwelling on this. Then Claudia asks Louis how being gay works. All Louis can tell her is that it's love. And this, as vague and noncommittal as it is the first time we've ever heard him say anything about loving Lestat at all. He seems to feel no bitterness or unhappiness towards Lestat anymore, or even about his vampire life in general now that he's comfortable eating animals. I guess he got over that whole eating animals makes him lose his libido thing and their romance is doing just fine. Well, nice to know that the issue that was so serious and dramatic in episode 3 doesn't matter anymore. Louis tells Claudia that he has never truly liked women, only pretended to, but he doesn't feel the need to do that anymore. Lestat, of course, still sometimes like women, and Claudia asks if Lestat's been dating girls when he goes out alone, but Louis confidently tells her that Lestat's only going out to kill because he respects Louis's animal-eating ways and doesn't kill in front of Louis anymore. No more open relationship for these two, a perfectly content family. Louis then snatches a fish right out of the swamp and chomps down on it, much to Claudia's disgust. This leads to an important father-daughter talk about how even if she kills humans, she should avoid dramatic displays. And he tells her about how his kill of the alderman led to the fire that almost killed her. He explains this as being too caught up in human affairs, but now that she's in his life, he's not involved in them anymore. He's finally accepted Lestat's advice to let go of everything that tied him to the human world, and turns out Lestat was right all along, because Louis is finally happy. It wasn't being a vampire that was making him miserable before, it was trying not to be a vampire. In the book, when Claudia finds out that Louis was responsible for almost killing her, it is extremely upsetting and dramatic, but this Claudia just takes it in stride. His confession for being the cause of the fire that led to her becoming a vampire doesn't even make her bat an eye, because at this point, she is still happy to be a vampire. Unlike Book Louis, who kept this dark secret from her for decades, this Louis is being open and honest up front about his sins to avoid that drama later. Meanwhile, back in Dubai, it's now the middle of the afternoon, and Daniel hears the call to prayer out of his windows. It distracts him from his reading, so he follows the sound of Rasheed's voice to find him doing his prayers in a room full of sunshine. He makes a smarmy quip, asking Rasheed how Muhammad feels about vampires and him thinking of Louis as a god, but Rasheed changes the subject and asks about his reading, to which Daniel says,
"For a killing machine, I kinda like her."
When Rasheed calls his prayer a name that's different from the Arabic one Daniel expected to hear in Dubai, he deduces that Rasheed isn't a native, to which Rasheed replies that Dubai is a child of a city, and no one is a native here. And then Daniel goes back to his computer and opens up a document where he has been keeping notes on Rasheed. And when you pause and look at his notes, this is where it gets interesting. He's suspicious why Rasheed talks in such an old-fashioned, outdated way, why he can make a martini so expertly when he seems too young to have the life experience, to which he adds, what is his endgame? Daniel wants to know why someone like Rasheed is working for a monster like Louis and what he hopes to get out of it. I mean, I know what I would hope to get out of it, but to me, as well as any well-versed vampire fan, my alarm bells are going off. Rasheed thinks Dubai is a child of his city, but if we're being generous and saying he's just talking about modern fancy skyscraper Dubai, we'll say it started in 1966. Yes, a very new city, but Rasheed doesn't look much older than 30. If he was born in the 90s, he very well still could be a native to Dubai. What an old person thing to say.
And sometimes you speak like you're from a different time. You never eat or drink anything. You don't go out in the sunlight.
But wait, wasn't Rasheed in the sunlight when he was praying and when he went to the balcony to see Daniel this morning? Let's rewind the tapes. No, he is always just inches away from the sun. And what else? Rewind the tapes.
I serve a god. No third parties.
Yes, Rasheed is always wearing gloves. We never once see his fingernails. You guys, this dude has got to be a vampire, but not just any vampire. When Daniel was trying to guess the language Rasheed was speaking, he guesses Kazakh or something from the Crimea. I tried Googling it myself, and Google told me it was maybe Uzbek. But if Daniel was closer with his guess of the Crimea, do you know where that is, right? That's the Ukraine right there. And he lives with Louis. What Ukrainian vampire did Louis in the books live with on and off for decades? You guys, I think Rasheed is Armand. But what about his eyes, you ask? They look normal. I don't know. Maybe he's hiding his vampire eyes with contacts. But why would Armand hide his eyes and fingernails and pretend to be Louis's groveling human servant to trick Daniel? I don't know. Maybe so Daniel wouldn't freak out about coming to a house with two vampires instead of just one. Or maybe there's some really significant plot element that we can't predict. Or, maybe the show just wanted to have some big twist reveal later on to blow the audience's minds. I haven't seen the last 2 episodes. I have no idea what's going to happen. I mean, I could be wrong. I could be completely wrong about the Armand part anyway. Maybe Rasheed is just some random new vampire that Louis ended up with after he and Armand broke up, which they did in the book. When Louis is telling Daniel his interview, he and Armand have been split up for a while. So maybe this 50 years later AU Louis found someone new, or maybe even made Rasheed into a vampire himself to be his servant. I mean, that would be entirely against Louis's character in the books. He would never make another vampire of his own free will, but this new show Louis is different, so maybe he did. But if he didn't, the only other vampire Louis ever lives with after Lestat and Claudia is Armand. And you know what? 2 months ago, well before I ever saw any of the episodes, just knew what I could from the casting announcements and the stuff that there was some character named Rasheed living with Louis. And there was this rumor going around the fandom that Armand would appear in the very last episode of the season, but they couldn't reveal who the actor playing him is because it would be this huge spoiler, supposedly. So I says to my group chat, I says, hey, what if that Rasheed guy who lives with Louis turns out to be, the guy who actually lives with Louis a lot in the books? The surprise Armand? I mean, who else would Louis live with? But I was just mostly being silly because, of course, we were convinced the Rasheed character was human, and his casting call listed him as this tiny background part, not a major character that would be kept for future seasons. But that could all be part of the surprise. Armand has a very complicated relationship with religion, and we see Rasheed is also religious, except just Muslim instead of Christian. And the gloves, and always staying an inch away from the sunbeam, it's gotta be. In a way, I really hope I'm right, because it is so satisfying to see clues and foreshadowing in a show build up, and then for the payoff to be exactly what it seems it's going to be leading to. And I really like the actor from what I've seen so far, Assad Zaman. But in another way, I wouldn't mind being completely wrong, because Rasheed is a very different character from Armand in the books, not just in appearance and age and origins, but in personality and mannerisms as well. And I would be so excited to see who they do cast for Armand if it's someone very surprising and perhaps close to canon. The new versions of Louis and Claudia in this show have been extremely interesting, but wouldn't a canon-accurate Armand be great? Okay, I'm done. Daniel goes back to Claudia's diaries, and we see he's reached the year 1921 in her story. And she's about to turn 17 and has finally gotten her own bedroom. The townhouse is pretty big, and the room was always there. No idea why it took 3+ years for her to move out of her parents' room. Maybe they just didn't trust her sleeping alone. She is very happy to have her own space now, and her coffin hidden behind a secret panel rotating wall with a bed on the other side. Such a cool room. We jump to her 17th birthday party, where they are celebrating with silly hats and a cake she can't eat. But don't worry, she has had her birthday feast already. There are 3 dead men on the couch while they party, and Louis seems to have no problem with this, not at all finding it repulsive the way he did with the opera singer in episode 2. Aside from the eating animals himself thing, he really is fully on board with the vampire stuff now. Yes, this is all told from Claudia's perspective, so maybe she's just never noticed if he's secretly in agony all along. But from what the show is showing us, Louis hasn't had to deal with a single racist for years now that we've seen, and his and Claudia's blackness has never even once come up. A stark change from how much of a focus his racial struggles were in the first 3 episodes. Could it be Lestat was right, that by embracing his vampire nature, racism really did magically disappear for Louis? What is the show trying to tell us with this? Lestat gives Claudia an emerald necklace that he says belonged to a marquis he once knew, and Sam Reed said in a recent interview that this mention was another hint to Lestat's backstory. And I am really curious who this marquis was. The only marquis Lestat knows in the book is his own father, but he was dirt poor and could never have owned such a fabulous jewel. Was this marquis some new significant piece of Lestat's expanded pre-Louis life, like his friendship affair with Don Zanetti was? All Lestat tells us is that the guy was beheaded by a mob 10 years after he gave him the jewel, and plenty of marquis were beheaded during the French Revolution, circa 1790-ish, so he could have been anyone. Lestat became a vampire in 1780, so that means he would have gotten the jewel when he was a brand new baby vampire. Can't wait to hear that story. But the length of the necklace's chain prompts Claudia to ask when she's going to grow bigger, and Louis awkwardly deflects the question. Uh-oh, it begins. Not being able to grow was one of Claudia's big conflicts in the book because, well, she was 5 and 3 feet tall, but this 14-year-old Claudia is as tall as I am, so how much bigger is she hoping to get? Bailey Bass says she wore a binder with her costume, so the effort to make her look younger included giving her a more childlike body type, but the show hasn't really done anything to make her look shorter. They don't use forced perspective with her fathers or put them on risers, and when we see her kill the cops she kills on the first night, they're almost the same size, even though Louis says out loud that the cop was twice her size. He really wasn't, and the show didn't try to make him look to be. But Claudia's question about the necklace gets the point across. It hasn't hit her yet that she's never going to change. And honey, you got a big storm coming. Claudia's voiceover leads us through a montage of their happy family life together over the next couple years. She tells us that Louis and Lestat have plenty of problems with each other, but she's their bridge in the middle to resolve them. Okay, what are these problems? We don't get any hint of what they might be, what conflict is in their life now, especially when Louis seems so chill with his vampireness and has had zero involvement with any humans all this time that we've seen. They go to the movies and laugh over Nosferatu, mocking the fake film vampires, and Claudia says they're just like a normal family. But then she tells us all the easy times end when Louis' mother dies in January of 1923. At the wake, Louis' sister is cold to him, and Louis is harsh with her, and we see that the relationship they once valued is truly dead. After the uncomfortable encounter, when Louis leaves with his vampire family, he walks in solidarity with them. This is his world now. The human stuff is all behind him, even in his heart. The problem here, though, is that Claudia acts weird and creepy at the wake, and they realize that they've kept her sheltered from society too long, and she doesn't know how to blend in with humans properly. Lestat thinks a solution to this is to take her to Lover's Lane to feed on people having sex in their cars, which Louis is upset about. And yes, here is one of those problems Claudia mentioned, but it's all centered on her. If, after all the high-stakes drama of the first 3 episodes, disagreement about parenting styles is the worst of their issues, they seem to be doing all right. But when Claudia watches The Lovers, she has an epiphany, a sexual awakening of her own as she realizes what she's missing in her unchanging life. She's 5 months away from turning 19, and she wants to start dressing like a sexy adult. Her fathers are surprised, but supportive, though Louis speaks to Claudia in her mind, telling her not to act like Lestat. She admonishes him because talking to each other in their minds is against the family rules. I guess they really did take that rule seriously and, never use it. As they watch their little chick fly out of the nest, Louis puts his hand on Lestat's shoulder. An affectionate touch from Louis! Mark it down in the annals! It's like sighting a rare bird. God, Lestat's sweater is hideous. Did he lose a bet or something? Book Lestat would never. Claudia goes out on the town, enjoying the attention her sexy outfit is getting until some mean white bitches mock her as a little girl playing dress-up, calling her a racial slur. Oh, Claudia, see what happens when you try to go mingle with humans? Stick to your vampire bubble where racism apparently somehow magically doesn't exist. Her temper flares, and her fangs pop out as she's consumed with rage, but the unnaturalness of her vampire nature spooks a nearby horse, and she gets control over herself, burying her face in some white chrysanthemums until her fangs go back in. In the book, Claudia believes in the symbolism of flowers, and Louis tells us that to her, chrysanthemums always meant death. This Claudia doesn't seem to think anything about the flowers, but the show has put them there for us as a nice foreshadowing. Death is imminent. The handsome young carriage driver calms the horse, and when he checks if Claudia's okay, they are both instantly attracted to each other. Claudia has her first teenage crush. She's so into this guy that she doesn't even react when he points out how unusual it is for a colored family to have a house in the French Quarter. Later, the boy, Charlie, leaves her a bouquet of white chrysanthemums, and as she goes running out the door to get them, we hear Lestat chatting with Louis, saying, "I met Victor once." And of course, my first thought is, Victor Hugo. Is he part of Lestat's missing history too? Suspicious of Claudia's squealing, Louis breaks the rules again and reads her mind, finding out she has a paramour, so Claudia starts deliberately blocking her mind against him, which is something the vampires can do in the books. And I'm guessing this blocking is going to become plot relevant soon, because why else give Louis and Claudia this power only for them to never use it? This is building up to something. It has to be. Claudia and Charlie start dating, despite his reservations that she's too young for him. She tells him she's actually 19, so I'm not sure if 5 months have passed since the night they met, or if she's lying about her age slightly. Why wouldn't she just say she's 18? He's 18. She convinces Charlie that she's older, so he's finally comfortable taking things to the next level, and they're fooling around in his carriage. And he must be really into her because his horse is totally spooked by the creepy vampire girl and freaking out in the stall right next to them. As things start to get hot and heavy, and Charlie adoringly calls Claudia an angel, her vampire urges take over, and she bites him and drinks. She doesn't seem to realize what she's doing until it's too late, and he's suddenly not moving anymore. Damn you, white chrysanthemums! She takes him home and begs Lestat to make Charlie a vampire to save him, but he's already dead, and it's too late. Lestat takes the opportunity to teach Claudia a harsh vampire lesson. He coldly makes her clean up after herself and put the body in the incinerator and forces her to watch. As Claudia sobs, he tells her that they can never get close to humans without feeling this kind of pain. When it comes to love, they only have each other in their vampire bubble. Louis is upset by Lestat's harshness, but he does nothing to stop it, and when he tries to comfort Claudia, she rejects him. Cut back to Dubai, and Daniel is clearly moved by what he's read, and it must be nighttime by now because Louis is awake and joins him. Daniel launches right back into the interview, asking Louis why he didn't share these diaries in their first interview. Louis tells him that Claudia was everything to him, and that she completely swept away all his worries and cares from his mortal life before her. He and Daniel bond over what it's like to have daughters, and Daniel hints at the struggle it is to keep their love. Louis tells him that he didn't want to share the diaries before because he didn't want to admit the vulnerability of the ways he failed his daughter. He mentions again the gay tiki bar where he and Daniel first met, calling it Polynesian Mary's. In the book, it has no name, but in the original short story that Anne Rice expanded into this book, it was named The Pink Baby. Considering all the little details the show likes to toss in from the books here and there, I wonder why they didn't decide to use the same name for the bar. When they return to Claudia's diary, Louis tells Daniel that Charlie's death in 1923 shattered the delicate balance of their household and brought about the darkest era of their lives. He calls the happiness that they'd shared for the previous 6 years together a fantasy. So to him, the one happy family bliss was never real. Is happiness not real if it doesn't last? Does it not count in the moment? Or did he just realize that he hadn't actually been happy all along? He sure looked happy in all those montages. Maybe that's just the way Claudia perceived him and Lestat could see through it, and that's what caused those problems she talked about. I wish we could have seen some of those conversations. Daniel calls Claudia a band-aid for a shitty marriage, and Louis says she probably felt that way, implying that he never saw her that way. To him, she had nothing to do with his relationship with Lestat. To him, the love between himself and Claudia was the most important thing in his existence. Back into Claudia's diary, we see her overhearing Louis and Lestat fighting over Lestat's harsh lesson, which leads to her having a hysterical breakdown, going between laughing and crying as she starts writing more and more aggressively, insulting even her diary, her most beloved possession. She rants on the page about how she'll never grow past 14 to become a sexy lady, and how she'll never love another boy again after Charlie. But she tells her diary that she's fine, actually, because Charlie thought she was an angel. So she knows she's going to have a lot more vampire fun in her life. I'm not sure how these two things are connected, but it makes sense to her. Then she opens up the skylight and climbs onto the piano and hysterically sticks her arm right into the sunbeam, letting it burn her in an extreme act of self-harm until the episode finally ends on her piercing scream of agony. The dichotomy between her voiceover sinisterly telling us she's fine and optimistic about her future and the self-harm paint her as something of a mad woman, threatening chaos and mania to come. But to me, burning herself doesn't seem insane. It's a desperate effort to have some sort of control over her existence that no one can take from her. Even though she has body dysphoria now, it's still her body, and she can do with it what she wants. Here, the vampire has continued the theme of the illusory horror of the previous episode. I guess Louis didn't learn his lesson last time because once again, he is seduced by the Faustian promise of happiness and freedom vampirism can give him with his immortal companions, only for that to be ripped away when it's time to pay the price. And this time, it's so much worse because now it's not his own suffering, but that of his daughter. The most important thing in his existence. Saving her was supposed to be his redemption. The act of salvation that would keep Mephistopheles from dragging him down to the pits of hell. But even though he thought he'd ended up in heaven for a good 6 years there, it turns out he's only dragged Claudia down into the living hell with him. Is this a vicious cycle Louis' doomed to repeat for eternity? Does it all go this way again when he'll meet Armand in season 2? Or is it a fool me twice, shame on me situation that he'll never fall into again, portending a century of misery to come with no fantasy of happiness right up until he tells Daniel this story? He certainly doesn't seem happy in his modern life. Self-aware and able to convince even hard-hitting, cynical, jaded journalist Daniel that this time, even though some of the minute details might be fuzzy, Louis is, in fact, a reliable narrator about the important facts of the story that matter. Convinced Daniel hard enough of this that he trashed the tapes. And next time, we'll get back to Louis' narration and see what he has to say about just how their vampire lives changed after Claudia's hysterical breakdown. I am some Maven of the Eventide, and we have definitely got a big storm coming. here. This is the part where I invite you to join my Patreon to help me make more of these videos. If you pledge $2 or more, you get early access to all my videos before I make them public on YouTube. And if you pledge $10 or more, you get your name in the credits, just like those sweet people you saw just now. I also invite you in to join my Discord server, where we can all talk the night away one-on-one in real time about all our vampire fancies. The links to both Patreon and Discord are in the description of this video, and I will see you there.